Need some new Modern Horizons cards? Well, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom by heading over to cardkingdom.com.
Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and we have a super sweet video today. As you know, Modern Horizons 2 is, well, it's out on Magic Online. It's releasing in paper the end of this week, which means it's time to start talking about what this set can do in various constructed formats, and we have a very special guest today. We're talking about one of my current favorite formats, Legacy, and we're joined by MTGGoldfish Eternal Expert, Joe Dyer does This Week in Legacy Vintage 101. Joe, thanks so much for joining us to talk about some Legacy cards from MH2.
Thanks, Seth. I'm really excited to talk about this set. There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, this set is insane. So we have a top 10 list today, along with one honorable mention card, and we're just going to count down the best Modern Horizons 2 cards for the Legacy format. So I guess we should probably just jump right into it and start talking new Magic cards. So honorable mention, we have a blue 7-drop that isn't really a 7-drop, Murktide Regent, kind of the new Tombstalker, I guess. This is a card, Joe, where when they spoiled it, I really didn't know how good it was. Like, Tombstalker used to be good, but it's kind of fallen out of favor. This is clearly better than Tombstalker. Is it enough better to make a Tombstalker-like creature playable in Legacy? What do you think about this one?
I think this card is neat. I think the problem this card has is that there were other cards that were spoiled in this set that make the Delver shells, especially, this is where that would normally go, would be like a Delver shell. And that's one of the things is like all these Delver shells are going to be playing cards that are a little bit more low to the ground than this. And this also competes with space with another Delve threat that the Delver shells have been playing, which is Ethereal Forager. And they serve a little bit of a different kind of roles. So I'm not sure how good this is. I haven't seen it in play yet from people's screenshots on Magic Online yet. But it looks neat. But I don't know that it will be good enough to compete with Ethereal Forager, because Ethereal Forager also is basically like card draw and like card advantage at the same time. So
yeah, I think one of the things that makes Ethereal Forager powerful is it has that kind of snowball effect if it stays out on the battlefield for a couple of turns, because you're getting that spell back every single turn. Murktide Regent, it's going to be huge, which is nice, but it's kind of just huge for the most part. You're not getting any card advantage. If it dies, it just kind of straight up dies. So I do wonder where it's going to fit, but it certainly seems like a card that's worth keeping in mind, just because there's a pretty long history of these big delve threats to be pretty playable. So whether or not it actually makes it in our new world of Modern Horizons 2 Legacy, we'll have to wait and see. I think there's some other cards higher on our list that might kind of be competing for slots in the same decks that this one would be, and that might be a bit of an issue, but it'll be interesting to see if Murktide Regent actually can do anything in Legacy.
for sure.
Let's move on to our actual top 10 list, starting with number 10 on our list. We have one of the first cards previewed from the entire set, one of the weirdest cards in the entire set, Urza's Saga, a enchantment land saga. This card is, I mean, it does a lot of cool things, and it's really powerful. My question is, where does this fit? Like, what kind of deck would play this in Legacy, Joe?
Yeah, there has been some talking about like decks like Delver actually playing a copy or two of this just because of how good it is in like a grindy situation. I don't know. It's certainly a weird card to evaluate. And I think it's going to be down to players just playing the card more, to really figure out where best it goes. I do still think that there could be some deck based around this card still. Like, I think this is more of like a build around card that might actually be pretty good if you build around it and are enabling it well. So
yeah, so this is a card that to me kind of screams out for some sort of artifact deck. I mean, it's got a ton of possibilities. You can play it in a loam deck to take advantage of the fact that it's a land that sacrifices and you can keep getting it back and reusing it. You can use it in grindy matchups and something like Delver. But we've seen the construct, the Karnstruct as it's sometimes called, be especially powerful in decks with a lot of artifacts.
yeah.
Is there a affinity style shell or something along a stack style shell? Is there anything like that in Legacy that can really take advantage of the artifact Karnstruct aspect of this card?
I think the closest thing would be Steel Stompy. which is a Ancient Tomb Chalice of the Void deck that plays like Arcbound Ravager and Walking Ballista. Basically kind of what you would liken to like a modern Affinity style deck, except in Legacy.
Do you think a deck like that would take advantage of this card?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
oh, yeah. They're playing Mox Opal, and they're playing, all the other normal, like what you would consider Affinity level stuff, +1/+1 counter stuff, Hangerback Walker, Steel Overseer, Walking Ballista. Yeah, this is definitely a card that would fit into those kind of decks, especially in like situations where you need a threat on board and your creatures are being pushed out by other means or whatnot. This is just a better threat.
I know we're focused on Legacy today, but you're also our Vintage guy. What do you think about Urza Saga in Vintage? I know when this was first spoiled, there was some rumblings about like shop style decks. Like, is this a card that's going to show up in those decks? Is it going to be busted in those decks? Any like quick Vintage thoughts?
I think it's going to be very good. Already I've seen a couple people playing it in the Golos, the combo shops variants explicitly. And those are the decks that play like the Leyline of the Void, like Helm of Obedience kills. And also cards like Mirage Mirror and Thespian Stage, which is where I think this card really shines, is with stuff like Thespian Stage, because you can copy it and get an additional set of abilities out of it, and it's just, you can just keep it going with Thespian Stage. So I think that's probably going to be pretty good.
Yeah, that actually seems super powerful. Well, let's move on. Number 9 on our list. We have one of the most flashy new equipment that we've seen in a while, Kaldra Compleat. Kaldra Compleat. I assume this is a Stoneforge card? Is this going in Stoneblade decks, Joe, or is there some other possibilities for it in Legacy?
I think going in Stoneblade and also like Death and Taxes is a big deal. A lot of people are comparing this card to Batterskull, but my issue with that is that it's not the same card as Batterskull. Batterskull fills a different role in most games that you want to play Batterskull in. Stoneforge Mystic being like a toolbox type card allows you to pick a different equipment based on what role you need to play in the matchup. And this card just fills that like Reality Smasher style role so very well. I think that's the best card I could liken it to, is it's basically an equipment Reality Smasher. There's nothing in the format that can effectively block this, even profitably. Not even like True Name Nemesis can block this really profitably, because you'll still trample over for 4 damage.
Yeah, I think that Batterskull is actually... It's a very good defensive equipment. I mean, both cards are solid all around, but because of lifelink and vigilance, Batterskull is really good on defense. Kaldra Compleat is incredibly frightening on offense, and I think Reality Smasher is a really great comparison. My one question, my one concern, I guess, with Kaldra Compleat is, what do you think about the 7 mana casting cost? I know in Modern, when I was thinking about playing this card in Stoneblade style decks or Stoneforge decks, my worry was, okay, I'm going to play my Stoneforge on turn 2. I'm going to choose this over Batterskull, and then my opponent's going to bolt or fatal push my Stoneforge, and my deck probably is going to get to 5 mana eventually, but I don't know if it's ever going to get to 7 mana to actually just hard cast this. Is that a concern at all? Like your Stoneforge dying and this getting stuck in your hand? Or is it so powerful that it doesn't even really matter?
I think the 7 mana casting cost is a downside. Yeah, that is absolutely a big deal. You're probably not getting to 7 mana in some games, especially in Death and Taxes, where you're using your mana to do things like Rishadan Port and Wasteland, and you're using Aether Vial to cheat on mana. So getting this and then having your Stoneforge, dealt with is rough. However, there is also the caveat of your opponent going turn 1 Mother of Runes into turn 2 Stoneforge Mystic, fetch this, into turn 3 put this into play. And
yeah, I don't know how you lose if you have that start. Like, Kaldra Compleat is so insane.
Yeah, so like you're able to protect your Stoneforge Mystic with the Mother of Runes, and then if your opponent actually is playing Swords of Plowshares, then you can protect the token with from Swords of Plowshares. But then also, if your opponent does Swords of Plowshares the token, you can Flicker Wisp the equipment and get it back.
Oh, that's actually really sweet. I hadn't really thought about using it to reset it, because when I think of Batter's Call, one of the upsides is, I can always bounce it back to my hand, put it back into play with Stoneforge. Flicker Wisp is kind of a way to reset your Kaldra Compleat, which is already a card that sees play in Death and Taxes. So that's actually an upside I hadn't really thought about. That's super, super sweet and seems pretty powerful.
The other thing about this card is that it comes down to basically a full turn cycle before Batterskull. Because you generally, when you're putting Batterskull into play, you're waiting until the end of your opponent's turn to put it into play. And this comes down immediately because it has haste. And that,
yeah, you just want to main phase this and smash.
Right. So I think this card is going to be very good. There's going to be certainly decks where your opponent's going to look at this card and go, I just can't beat this. Like Grixis Control and Bug, control decks are going to look at this card and go, I cannot beat this card like ever. So they're going to look at their Colligon's command and go, well, so.
All right, let's keep moving forward to number 8 on our list. We have a card that people are incredibly hyped about for Commander, but I think also has a lot of potential in 60 card formats. Esper Sentinel, kind of a white creaturey mystic Remora almost, that you don't have to worry about sacrificing yourself eventually because you can't pay its cumulative upkeep. What do you think about this one in Legacy, Joe?
I think this is going to be neat. It's definitely got kind of like a taxi feel to it. You want to prevent them from drawing a card. So you're going to tax their mana even more, especially if you're already taxing them with like Thalia and effects like that. So, and if you have any way of pumping this, then it gets even better, and it gets better in multiples. The other thing I think is relevant is that its creature type is human. And that might bump the humans deck a little bit more in Legacy.
Yeah, it does seem like it's pretty easy to get value out of this. The human type is nice. It's also an artifact, if that's relevant. Not sure how much that's going to matter for Legacy in specific. But really, I don't think this is a card you need to draw a ton of cards off of to make it good. Like, even if your opponent just kills it and it cantrips and they traded their swords or Fatal Push or Lightning Bolt for your 1-drop and you got a card out of it, that's still a pretty good exchange for your 1-mana creature. And as you said, if you can get like a equipment on this, a sword or a Batterskull or somehow Kaldra on it, that's going to be absolutely insane, because essentially it's just either don't cast your non-creatures or give me a card every turn when you cast them. Is this a card you think you would main deck? Like, in the Legacy meta, is it spell heavy enough that you think that this is going to trigger in most matchups? Or is it more of like, I put this in the sideboard and bring it in against, the heavy like Brainstorm, spell, cantrippy Delver style decks or whatever?
I think those are going to be most of the format after this particular set. So yeah, I could see humans maybe main decking this. Maybe not Death and Taxes, but definitely humans.
Well, let's move on. We'll get to the Delver stuff eventually. I promise. It's on our list. Yeah. Number 7 on our list, we have the Green Urborg, Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. So this card, obviously, we know Urborg is very good. It sees play in a lot of different decks. Sometimes it's a one-of, sometimes it's more of like a build around in Liliana or Pox decks where you're like sacrificing your own land so you can get around the legendary drawback. How good is a green version of Urborg? Like, is it as powerful as the original? What kind of decks does this one go in, Joe? 2 words, Gaia's Cradle. So Legacy Elves often plays a playset of Quirion Ranger. And using this card in conjunction with Gaia's Cradle to save your Gaia's Cradle from like wasteland effects is just absolutely bonkers. So I would assume we'll see it in Legacy Elves for sure. The other deck is Legacy Lands. And that's simply because that deck plays a lot of cards that don't generate green mana. You have your Maze of Ys, your Wastelands, your Rishadan Ports, your Tabernacle. Tons of cards that don't produce mana on their own or just don't produce green mana. And having a card that suddenly just turns them on with no other, opportunity cost other than putting a land into play is actually really good. Yeah, especially as like a one of, it's pretty free rolly, I would say. The other deck I was thinking of is maybe 12 Post.
Yes.
That also has some lands that don't actually tap for mana, and it wants green mana, but it wants to play a ton of colorless lands. It wants to play like Bajuka Bog and Glacial Chasm and so forth. It seems like another, at least a good one of tutor target there, where sometimes you're gonna have a bunch of lands that don't make mana or only make colorless mana, and this all of a sudden is gonna let them cast your Primeval Titan or whatever.
Yeah, the mono green 12 Post decks will definitely want this as well. So this is definitely a powerful card. I would not be surprised to see this show up. I've also heard people talking about it in Maverick even. So because they, again, also play a lot of lands that tend to not tap for their colors. So
I mean, yeah, as we've seen with Urborg, it's one of those cards that if you're playing a green deck, I guess there's more in Legacy as a Wasteland format, but still, there's not a ton of downside of playing as a one of, is there? If you're like playing a deck like Maverick or whatever, like, is Wasteland so big of a deal that you would not play it? Or do you just like kind of free roll this as a one of and trust that it's going to be good enough?
Oh, I would absolutely just play it as a one of, especially in decks that are playing cards like Knight of the Reliquary, because you can turn everything into a Knight of the Reliquary target at that point.
Oh yeah, that's actually super sweet to be able to sack your Bajuka Bog or whatever to Knight of the Reliquary, and after you use it seems incredibly powerful. Whew. Yeah, that's even better than I thought. I like it.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on. Number 6 on our list. We're staying with the green cards, and we have our first of what is probably the most pushed for constructed cycle for Modern Horizons 2, the free evoke elemental cycle. We have Endurance. This is one of the free evoke cards that I like a lot because I feel like this has the best body of the bunch. A lot of the other ones are like 4 or 5 mana. They're like 3/2s, which isn't bad, but Endurance, a 3 mana 3/4 with flash and reach. Like, sure, Graveyard Hate is somewhat conditional, but the body's legit. Like, worst case, this eats a Delver or something by surprise. You get a like legitimate Ambush Viper that can snag an attacking creature. But Joe, I'm kind of rambling on. What do you think about Endurance in Legacy?
I think this is better than Leyline of the Void in certain decks, like Hogak especially would probably play this over Leyline of the Void, simply because it's a creature and it triggers Vengevine. It also will probably see play in Elves over Leyline of the Void because you have a lot of green spells to pitch to it, and making 3 mana is like trivial to that deck to just hard cast it if they want to. I think the real best part about this card is that it's going to be really good against decks like Doomsday. So your opponent casts Thassa's Oracle and you put this into play, they're not winning the game. You're going to put their graveyard back into their library, and they're going to resolve a Thassa's Oracle with like 3 or 4 cards in their library. And it's just not going to work.
That's actually hilarious. I had not thought about this fizzling Thassa's Oracle kills, but that is actually a really excellent point. Yeah, I love this card. I mean, there's some powerful graveyard decks. This works really well in creature decks. It's got a reasonable body. It hates on a lot of things. It's just like a really solid card all around. Do you think there's decks like, you know, the Legacy format better than I do, like Green Sun Zenith style decks, maybe like Maverick? Let's go back to Maverick again. Is this a main deck like one of, or is this more just like a sideboard hate card replacing Leyline of the Void, do you think?
It could end up seeing play as like a main deck card. I think it's useful enough. So, I mean, especially in decks that play Green Sun Zenith, you could probably play it. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how good it is, but I'm excited for it. It's certainly going to be an interesting card.
Well, speaking of Green Sun Zenith targets, let's move on to number 5 on our list. One of the most unique cards from Modern Horizons 2, and one of my personal favorites, because I think this one goes into one of my favorite Legacy archetypes, Grist, the Hunger Tide, a Planeswalker that is also a 1/1 insect that you can find with Green Sun Zenith or Collected Company or Chord of Calling, any of that kind of stuff. You can reanimate it with Unearth or Reanimate or whatever. Joe, what do you think about our new insect creature / Planeswalker in Legacy?
I'm super excited to play this card. I'm not going to lie. I'm just like really super excited to play this card. I think this card is very good. Like I just anything that plays Green Sun Zenith, I think Maverick might even want it as a one of. You can sack your Dryad Arbor, you know, to the negative, the neg 2 ability. It creates a body, it mills. maybe puts a land in the graveyard for Knight of the Reliquary. Just having a Planeswalker that can't be force and negationed is, I think, really exceptionally strong. And at a competitive mana cost, we have yet another 3 mana Planeswalker that you can't ignore that as a casting cost anymore. So
yeah, I actually love this card too. This is one of my favorite cards from the entire set. The big thing I'm hyped about is I feel like this is a really sweet one-of for Nick Fit Shells. It feels like it kind of does a lot of what that deck wants as a one-of Green Sun Zenith target. Like, the deck kind of plays weird grindy stuff anyway, but it can really take advantage of the negative to sacrifice ability. Like having this Planeswalker that you can Green Sun Zenith up to sack your like Academy Erector or even your Veteran Explorer or something seems like the perfect like one of. Plus, this thing just seems hard to get through in fair matchups. Like, the +1 Make an Insect doesn't seem like much, but the combination of that with the -2 to blow up a creature or Planeswalker, the card can really grind once it's on the battlefield. Plus, you get all those insect synergies where you get all the creature synergies. So yeah, this is one of my favorite cards from the whole set, I think.
Yeah, it's certainly neat. I'm excited to play with it.
Well, let's keep moving on. Number 4 on our list, we have Evoke Elemental number 2, Solitude, a free Swords to Plowshares. If you're willing to force a will yourself, going down a white card to evoke it into play. Otherwise, 5 mana, kind of a little bit steep, but what do you think about this one, Joe?
I think in a lot of like the mono white shells, maybe even Death and Taxes typically tends to play like Path to Exile in the sideboard. This is a Swords to Plowshares that hits Emrakul. I think that's like the biggest thing to note about this card. So, yeah, I think this card's probably pretty good. I'm curious to see where it goes, but I do think it's going to be excellent.
Yeah, this whole most of the cycle is really pushed. That's a good point about Emrakul. I feel like you're probably not replacing Swords to Plowshares with this, I would assume, in your Legacy deck, because 2-for-1ing yourself is a little bit painful if you can avoid it. So I don't think this replaces swords, but as your backup swords or your sideboard swords or whatever, this seems like a really excellent option. I hadn't even thought about getting rid of Emrakul. Also breaks up other creature-y combo style decks, gets rid of anything at instant speed. Yeah, just another just really solid. It's kind of hard to talk too much about these cards because it feels like Wizards just like push them all based on like their rate, and it's just like, it's obviously really pushed and really good.
Yeah, I'm already working on a list for the Vile Elementals list. Ooh. Where I would play a playset of these main because you play enough white cards. There's certainly enough white elementals between Flicker Wisp and Voice of Resurgence and Unsettled Mariner to play this main deck. So it's kind of like having Swords to Plowshares without having to actually have Swords to Plowshares. So
yeah, that Elemental is a good point. I hadn't really considered that the creature type might actually be relevant in some decks, but yeah, that does sound super spicy. Well, let's move forward. Number 3 on our list, we're sticking with the free elementals, Grief. This is the one that I had on the top of my list as well as the most powerful of the cycle. It compares a little bit to Unmask with maybe a bit of a drawback that you can't target yourself with it. So what do you think about this one, Joe? Is this something that you're just playing for value, or do you think that the combo people keep talking about of like ephemerating it on turn 1 or something to triple Thoughtseize, like, is that something you're interested in building around in Legacy, or is this just like, this card's really good, it's a Thoughtseize on a body, I can cast it for free? What do you think?
This triggers Vengevine. So I'm thinking of it more in shells where you're going to cast it, you're going to take a spell from your opponent's hand, and you're going to be able to trigger Vengevines with it and other cards that you want to trigger with Vengevine. So I think this is really good in those kind of aggressive shells like that. I don't think the Ephemerate synergy is there in Legacy. There's too much incidental counter magic, but you can play this on turn 1 through a daze, and that's probably pretty good. So I think that's probably going to be the best place for it.
So what do you think about the comparison to Unmask? Is Grief a card that replaces Unmask, or does the Unmask myself to get my reanimation target or whatever in the graveyard? Is that enough of a thing that decks will just not run Grief over Unmask?
I've heard that a lot of the Reanimator players are split on that, but I believe that Unmask still probably ends up being better in those scenarios because there are a lot of scenarios where you cast Unmask and target yourself in Reanimator. It's just the way it goes. So giving that up just for a possible body, I don't know. Now, this could see play as an additional set of copies of Unmask, where you could play it, evoke it, put it into the graveyard, reanimate it, put it into play, get another card, that sort of thing. So
that's actually seems like a somewhat reasonable backup plan. Obviously, if you're trying to reanimate, your goal isn't to reanimate a Grief, but I mean, when all else fails, 2 Thought Seizes and a 3/2 on turn 1 is not horrible.
Yeah. I mean, obviously you want to be doing Gristlebrand stuff, but yeah, I mean, sometimes, it's worth it to have an additional set of disruption.
Yeah, no, that's actually a good point. So maybe if you want more than 4 Unmasked, this is obviously the way to go, since it's the only other thing that's very Unmask-esque in the format. Well, let's keep moving forward. Number 2 on our list. We're entering the realm of red 1-drops. Ragavan, Nimble, Pilferer. This card just has so much text. It does so many things. Where does this fit in Legacy, Joe? Like, what kind of deck is going to play Ragavan? It's obviously a powerful card, but where does it go?
Delver of Secrets. Yeah. So I've seen there are a lot of people that are really split on how this card is, whether or not this card is playable or not. I know a lot of the people that I'm friends with, big Delver players like Rich Callie, Bob Huang. I know that they have come out and said that they believe this card is probably pretty as close to Deathrite Shaman / Dreadhorde Arcanist level of a card as we're getting at this point. And it does give me those vibes. This card has a lot of power to it, but the real meat of this card is the fact that it makes a treasure token. The exiling the top card of their library is kind of just like icing on the cake. But the treasure token is like the biggest thing about this card. A way I've explained this card to people is that think about a card in Legacy that you have to block or remove or some other fashion of thing that you have to do to get it off the table before it connects with a combat damage trigger is Goblin Lackey. And Goblin Lackey, obviously, proponent plays a turn 1 Goblin Lackey, you know immediately that you have to get rid of this card. It either has to be countered, it has to be removed, or you have to play a blocker. This is a similar card. And except the upside of this card is that you get to play Daze. You get to play Force of Will. You get to play Force of Negation, Brainstorm, Ponder. And that makes it scary.
Yeah, the treasure ability it's very, very frightening. That can just lead to some incredibly explosive starts. Like if you can play this on turn 1 and get in that hit on turn 2 and you have access to 3 mana, you can do all kinds of things. And it keeps snowballing turn after turn. It's this 1-drop that can snowball, and then who knows, maybe, sooner or later, eventually you get some value off the top of your opponent's deck. I think, as you said, you're not playing it to steal your opponent's cards. You're playing it for the treasure ability and because it's pretty on curve. But every once in a while, I don't know, you snag a Thoughtseize or something, and it might actually be kind of sweet to cast your opponent's Thoughtseize off the treasure. But my main question for this card, so we were talking about Delver Shells. So you got Delver of Secrets. You now have Ragavan. The number 1 card on our list has been also compared to Delver of Secrets. Pretty directly Dragon's Rage Channeler. Where does that fit in the mix? Are you going to play all of them? Are you going to play Delver, Ragavan, and Dragon's Rage Channeler? And that's like your creature base of a really low to the ground Delver style deck. What do you think about Dragon's Rage Channeler and where it fits in the Delver mix?
I think the card is actually really good. The problem with Dragon's Rage Channeler, and it's sort of like the dichotomy of the 2 cards. I think you'll see 2 camps. I think you'll see people that are playing Ragavan. I think you'll see people that are playing Dragon's Rage Channeler. There might be people that try both. They're really hard to support in both because you also have to kind of like make deck building adjustments for Dragon's Rage Channeler. Because in order to effectively turn on Delirium, you need to play another card type, which is usually going to be a card like Mishra's Bauble, is generally what's going to end up seeing play. But that kind of like low to the ground style really works well for the deck. So, if you play like this and if you play Dragon's Rage Channel and you play Delver, you're probably playing Sprite Dragon. You're probably playing Brazen Borrower. You're able to use the Mistress Baubles effectively because it will trigger Sprite Dragon as well. The Surveil trigger on this is very strong. This could probably end up being better than Ragavan. That's why I have it as number 1 on this list, because it might end up being better than Ragavan, but I think it's a different style of, they're both kind of the similar kind of thing. The downside of this card is that if you turn it on, it has to attack. That's kind of like the little downside. You have to attack with the card, and there's going to be those moments where you're going to attack into your opponent's other Delver and go, oh, well. So
yeah, that is a bit of a drawback. I think the prowess style trigger of whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Surveil, that's actually a very powerful ability on a 1-drop, especially in the decks that you're talking about, like Delver style shells that already play a ton of cheap cantrips. Like, that's filling your graveyard to turn on Dragon's Rage Channeler. More importantly, it's just filtering through your deck and finding what you need and like improving your brainstorms and doing like it's just a really, really powerful ability on a 1-mana creature in a deck that's going to be casting a ton of spells. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how it shakes out. So is your thinking right now there might be like Ragavan Delver decks and then also Dragon's Rage Channeler decks, like kind of a split of the Delver archetype based on which of those 1-drops you're gonna play alongside your Delvers?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know that you'll play both of them, but I think you will play, or if you do play both of them, you might not play a full 4 Ragavan. You might play like 1 or 2 Ragavan in addition to your Dragon's Rage Channelers. But there's so many. The problem is now there are so many hyper efficient cards from this set for Delver decks that you have to figure out how to fit them all in. And so you have to make concessions based on that. The nice thing about Dragon's Rage Channeler is that the newest card that has broken into the Delver shell is Expressive Iteration. And that works really well with cards like Mistress Bauble. Basically, exile a Mistress Bauble with Expressive Iteration that's just free. So like that really works really well. This all just makes me maybe just think that now we could just never unban Lurrus, even though it might seem fine. Just scares me.
This might be heretical, but I gotta ask you, is there any chance that we're getting close to the point where Delver decks don't play Delver?
I don't think that will ever happen, simply because, well, let me roll back. I don't think it's something that will ever happen as the norm. Delver is just so aggressively one of the best 1-drops in existence. And there's just nothing like playing a turn 1 Delver, having a Daze, wastelanding them, and flipping your Delver. That's just the line of play that will always be like part of Legacy as long as the shell remains intact. So I don't think you would ever truly cut Delver. There are decks that have cut Delver and try to play like a tempo-y game, but those tend to play a lot of like 2-drops and like 3-drops, and they play more like a tempo mid-range style deck. They're not quite as low to the ground as Delver is. So I don't think Delver. I think Delver still remains the best.
Okay, so it's more the support cards that are improving rather than invalidating Delver itself. You kind of hit on something that was my last question, and then we'll wrap things up. You mentioned you think Delver will always be good as long as it remains intact. Looking at all these cards from Modern Horizons 2 and talking about how many new pieces Delver shells are getting, is that a concern in your mind or the Legacy community that maybe these cards are going to be so good that we're going to be heading towards the Delver deck needing a nerf and being targeted with a ban at some point in the not super distant future?
Yeah, I probably estimate that that's going to be the case, honestly. And I think, personally, and I've said this before in the articles a couple times, that instead we've had so many bans related to hitting Delver on the side of things, but never actually touching the core shell of Delver. I think a ban targeting towards a card like Daze would probably be a good thing for the format, because Daze kind of leads to these games where you have to play the Daze subgame no matter what. If your opponent plays turn 1 Delver of Secrets, you have to immediately consider that they have days, whether they even have it or not. And I think that removing that aspect of the game from those shells might make them a little fairer.
Yeah, I personally would not mind seeing Days getting banned. I think that that Pauper definitely improved once Days was no longer part of the Delver shells there. So who knows? I mean, obviously, it's a little early to speculate too much. The set's just releasing on Magic Online. So this is all, speculation, but it will be interesting to see where things take out. So I assume that archetype-wise Delver, you would say, is probably the biggest winner for Modern Horizons 2?
Yeah, Delver and a lot of the green decks. Yeah, those are also really good in this set. Like Elves definitely got some boosts from this set. Yeah, I mean, a lot of those decks, Green Sun Zenith decks, definitely got a big boost from this set as well. So I expect we'll see more Delver, more Elves, and as long as we have Delver at the top, Elves will definitely be also near the top, because that's a very good deck against Delver.
Well, I believe that brings us to the end of our top 10 legacy cards from Modern Horizons 2. So you've seen our list. Let us know what you think. Like, what are you hyped for about Legacy from the set? How good is Delver going to be? Let us know in the comments. Also, Joe, thank you so much for doing this. And why don't you let people know where they can find your content on a regular basis and find you?
So my articles are posted every Tuesday and every Thursday, with This Week in Legacy on Tuesdays and the Vintage 101 articles on Thursdays. You can also reach me on Twitter at VolrathXP. That's about it.
Awesome. Well, yeah, your articles are amazing. I've told you this before, but seriously, This Week in Legacy and Vintage 101, my favorite written content, I think, that we publish on Goldfish. So if you're a fan of either format, check them out. They are great articles. So Joe, thanks again for doing it. Thanks to everyone for watching, and keep an eye on the YouTube channel. We got more top 10s coming up, talking Modern, talking reprints for Modern, talking Commander. So those will be coming up in the near future. So thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks again to Joe for joining us. And this is the crew signing out.
Looking for more Modern Horizons 2 discussions? Well, make sure to check out our other top videos here and here.